impacts on our day-to-day lives, on our communities here in Wales. And we need, as we move forward into an even more uncertain future, the next 5 years look even more challenging. We have the re-election of the Orange Menace in the White House. In these uncertain times, the threats that are coming out of Washington already, it only highlights, and at a time, I would say, a reminder of the urgency of the climate crisis that's on us. These massive international problems that need cooperation and collaboration to solve only heighten why we need to be building stronger ties with our European neighbours. And I would argue, as everyone in this room would, we eventually need to be rejoining the EU as full members. So looking forward at the situation that we're in, what Brexit has led to, I sense a shift, I sense a welcome shift. I mean, events like today, the fact that we are now having conversations across the range, looking forward, not just looking back at the damage Brexit has done, but looking forward to how we can mitigate that, how we can move forward, how we can improve things, starting with improving those relations with our European neighbours, starting with the easy, the low-hanging fruit. And like many of you, I was at the rally in Cardiff Square last.
Father, the Reverend Canon Bob Morgan, the Vicar of Ely in Cardiff, and a Labour County Councillor in South Glamorgan. For education...
Cael dros ben, dros y 5 mlynedd diwethaf, i bobl sydd yn frwdfrydig dros yr Undeb Ewropeaidd. Does the translation work? Yeah. You can hear something, doesn't matter, it's not what's listening. It's quite emotional, isn't it? Being here, I think, after 5 years, you think about what we've all been through and how we all felt when the results of that referendum came in. I thought I'd start today by reading a quote of what I said to a Welsh newspaper a few days before the Brexit referendum. We're failing to make the emotional connection that we need to make in the Brexit discussion. And that's where the challenge is for us now. Now, yesterday, I spent the day in Ebbw Vale, in Tredegar, and in Blackwood. And everywhere I went, I saw signs of the massive contribution that the EU funds had made to those communities. Brand new college, new railway track, community buildings, training courses paid for by the European Social Fund. But 5 years ago, we failed to make that emotional connection between the EU and the people who lived in those communities. And that's one of the many reasons that today we're discussing the subject of Brexit 5 years on. And I think there's a lesson for us here in terms of the need to bring communities with us. A lesson that we must heed, not just in terms of the EU debate, but in terms of domestic challenges and divisions we're facing in our communities today, including the rise of the Reform Party. Now, as policymakers and as leaders, we need to make sure that we make an emotional connection and to demonstrate the relevance of what we're doing to the people we represent. I don't think it's any secret to any of you to understand how I felt when those referendum results came in. I suspect my reaction could be heard all the way to Brussels. But I think what matters now isn't how any of us voted back then, it's about what we've done since to find the best way forward for Wales. I think it's almost surreal to think back to that time. I think it represented a moment of profound change to our nation, with different visions of Wales and our future came, I think, into sharp focus. Many of our citizens who voted to leave the EU were driven by genuine concerns about our public services, democratic control, and economic fairness. They voted for what they genuinely believed would be a better path forward. I think it's fair to say that the campaign period saw complex claims and counterclaims that made it really challenging for voters to navigate the real implications of their choice. Many were moved by promises of additional funding for our NHS and public services. And we all remember that bus, don't we? 350 million a week for the NHS if we left the EU. it was clear that many felt their voices weren't being heard by distant institutions. And when the results came in, I think it marked not just a political decision, but a moment that revealed deep divisions in our society. And I think we've all got to work to heal those divisions. It showed us that different communities across Wales had varying experiences of that European membership. And those perspectives, I think, deserve our understanding and our respect. I remember on the day of the referendum, I've been out all day, it's been pretty miserable if I'm honest, and I remember just calling at a shop late at night and asking the guy behind the desk, which way did you vote? And he said, no, I voted for Brexit. And I just said, why the hell did you do that? And he said, it's not going to make any difference to me, it hasn't touched my life. And I just started thinking through some of the messages we were giving, some of the, freedom of movement, mobile phone coverage. He wasn't going to do any of that stuff. And I just realised that actually that connection, that emotional connection, we needed to have worked harder on that. So a formal departure from the EU 5 years ago on the basis of a hard Brexit negotiated by Boris Johnson, I think it wasn't just a procedural change, it was a moment that required us all to think very deeply about our future path as a nation. And I think here's the crucial thing. Regardless of how anyone voted, we all still, I hope, share common aspirations for Wales' prosperity and for our well-being. Wales is and always will be a European nation, not just geographically, but through our shared values, through our shared culture, through our centuries of interconnected history. And as a former MEP, I spent countless hours, 15 years in European corridors, forging partnerships, building relationships and championing Wales. Our European neighbours didn't just respect us, they admired us. And I think that respect still exists today. And I'm determined to ensure that Wales will continue to be a trusted and valued partner in Europe and beyond. I think these past 5 years have been a whirlwind and a crucible of challenges. We've had Brexit, we've had a global pandemic, we've had war in Europe and high inflation. And yet, amidst all the upheaval, Wales has remained steadfast in our commitment to working with our European friends and partners. Why? Because the fact is the big challenges we face, as Anthony suggested, climate change, inequality, economic uncertainty, they don't stop at borders. They command, they demand cooperation, not isolation. And we have big challenges to face, in particular in the face of Brexit. Just take trade. Between 2019 and 2023, the volume of Welsh goods exported to the EU fell by 8%. In the same period, Welsh food and drink exports reduced by 17%. Seafood exports dropped by a massive 75%. And let's not forget that since 2019-20, there's been a 66% drop in EU entrance to Welsh universities. And we know the impact that that is having on our higher education institutions, not least here in Cardiff. And that relationship with the EU is even more important to Wales than it is to England, because whilst almost 50% of England's goods in exports go to the EU, 60% of ours go to the EU. And that's before we look at the impact on our society of all those citizens who previously made valuable contributions to our communities. Many of those went home. I previously had an Eastern European dentist. And lots of people have been complaining about not being able to get a dentist. we had lots of Eastern European dentists before they went home. We know that around 2,000 EU care workers went home, leading to fragility in our care sector, having a knock-on effect on the NHS. The construction sector remains challenged, and Plas in West Wales can't find staff to operate them at the peak of the tourist season. And one of the things I did when I entered the Senedd, weeks after the Brexit vote, was to initiate a campaign called Diolch Doc, urging the Welsh public to make sure that our EU NHS workers felt welcome and to try and avoid a catastrophic exodus from our services. So, to all those who stayed in Wales from the EU, I want to thank you for your contribution that you're making to our nation, to our workforce, to our NHS, to our hospitality sector, and to our ability to build new infrastructure. And the great irony, of course, in all of this is that whilst the Brexiteers promised that leaving the EU would curb migration, we've seen a rise of 70,000 people coming to Wales from around the globe since the ending of the free movement of people. Many of these people, we are depending on them to bring our waiting list down, to contribute excellence to our academic institutions, and for business development, and to look after our elderly. Many of these are coming now from outside the EU rather than within. But I think we've got to remember that despite Brexit, the EU is still Wales's biggest trading partner and the largest source of inward investment. It's why we've kept our team in Brussels, a small but mighty group that ensures Wales's voice is heard loud and clear across Europe. That's why we appointed Derek Vaughan, a former MEP, as our Welsh Government representative on Europe. Derek just hasn't been our man on the ground, he's been a champion for Wales, opening doors, making connections, and reminding Europe that we're still very much in the game. But we're not simply maintaining existing connections, we're reimagining our economic potential. Our innovation strategy is transforming how a small nation can compete and collaborate in a post-Brexit world. When traditional political structures seem to be closing doors, we are opening new windows of opportunities. Consider our advanced manufacturing sector, the compound semiconductors cluster in South Wales. That's becoming a global technology hub, attracting international investment. Companies from across Europe are looking to Wales, not as a peripheral region, but as a centre of technological expertise. Our universities are no longer just educational institutions, they're innovation engines. The collaboration between Cardiff University's research facilities, Newport's Technology Park, and international tech partners is creating ecosystems of innovations that transcend national boundaries. Despite Brexit's challenges, Welsh tech startups are attracting venture capital from across Europe. Our coding academies and digital skills programs are ensuring that our young people are not just prepared for the future, they're actively creating it. From fintech in Cardiff to aerospace in North Wales, we're proving that Wales is a nation of creators, not just consumers outside of the EU. And we're doing this with a distinctly Welsh approach, collaborative, sustainable, community-focused. Our economic strategy isn't just about competition, it's about connection. We're showing that economic innovation is more than about just numbers. It's about people, it's about potential, and a vision that extends far beyond any single political moment. Our shining example, I think, of our determination to stay connected is the TIPE programme, our very own Welsh Youth Mobility scheme. And that has meant that thousands of learners have had the chance to experience the world, to grow to dream bigger. It's worth hearing about the story, I think, from the pupils at Carnarvon Alice Conwy. It's a referral unit for children who faced trauma, who participated in the TICE programme. This might have been the Erasmus programme in a previous life. They visited Finland last year, and for many it was the first time that they'd left Wales, and the experience changed their lives. It transformed their understanding of possibility. And the programme continues to be referenced by senior EU officials as an example of cooperation that goes beyond borders, goes beyond the EU. It's a testament, I think, to the resilience of our nation and a reminder that our commitment to our young people and our future remains strong. I want to be clear, we are not stopping here. I want Welsh young people to have the same opportunities as any young person in Europe. I want businesses to have access to the best talent. I want artists to tour freely. I want workers' qualifications to be recognised across borders. These aren't just luxuries, they're essentials if Wales is to flourish in the 21st century. And to our young people, I want to be absolutely clear, your horizons are not limited. We are creating pathways, building bridges, ensuring that your generations will be more connected, not less. We're developing language immersion programs, digital exchange platforms, and international work placement schemes that are going to ensure that Welsh young people remain EU and global citizens. But here's the good news. We're not powerless. Through the structures of the trade and cooperation agreement, through our partnerships and through sheer determination, Wales is proving that we can still influence, we can still innovate, we can still lead. We're an outward-looking European nation and will continue to engage with our European neighbours. The future remains in our hands, and we're going to continue to build bridges, not walls. Even if we wanted to rejoin the EU and the single market, the chances are that the EU probably wouldn't have us at this point in time. I think we've certainly got to strive for a closer relationship than the one we currently have. In 2023, we hosted the CPMR Atlantic Art Commission General Assembly, and it was the first time this prestigious event has ever been held in the UK post-Brexit. Ministers and senior officials from across Europe gathered here in Wales. Why? Because they see us as a credible, collaborative partner. These connections are vital to our shared fight against the challenges of things like climate change. And through agreements with regions like Brittany, Flanders, the Basque Country, Baden-Württemberg, we're tackling shared challenges like the climate crisis together. We have a very close partnership agreement with our nearest neighbours in Ireland. I'm delighted to see Denise here with us today. That's a really valuable interlocutor when it comes to our EU relationship. These partnerships aren't just about trade or policy, they're also about our values. And one area where Wales is leading the way is on sustainability. Our Wellbeing of Future Generations Act has captured the imagination of policymakers across Europe. We're the first nation in the world to have taken the UN sustainability goals and to transpose them into law. But it's not just law, it's a mindset, it's a commitment to leave the world a better place for those who come after us. And you know what, in return, we're learning from our European partners, and it's interesting to see that the EU has recently appointed effectively a new generations, a future generations commissioner as well. 5 years on from Brexit, I think there's a lot to reflect on, but one thing gives me hope, and I think that's the undeniable fact that Europe hasn't turned its back on Wales. They still believe in us, and we still believe in them. We're proving that international cooperation is not just about achieving a certain legal status. It's a lived experience. It's about shared values, mutual respect, and learning from different countries, regions, and people. So my challenge to everyone here today is, let's seize the opportunities we have. Let's push for that reset in the UK-EU relationship with the UK Labour government in Westminster. Let's demand better for our young people, our businesses and our communities. Let's forge a closer relationship than the one we have at the moment. 5 years on, I think there's a lot to reflect on, and that's what gives me hope. It's how we've all adapted to forge new pathways forward. Our European neighbours, they remain our friends, they remain our partners, while here at home we're finding innovative ways to work together across different perspectives and different priorities. We're demonstrating that meaningful international cooperation isn't just about formal agreements, it's about the countless daily connections between people, businesses and communities. It's about finding practical solutions to shared challenges, whether that's tackling climate change, growing our economy, or creating opportunities for young people. So my challenge to everyone here today is this. Let's focus on the practical opportunities ahead. Let's work constructively with all our partners, both within the UK and across Europe, to build relationships that benefit everyone in Wales. And let's ensure that we look to the future. The past 5 years have not always been easy, but I think they've shown Wales's remarkable resilience and adaptability through programmes like TIDE, through our sustainable initiatives, through our regional partnerships. I think we've proven that Wales can forge its own positive path forward whilst respecting different views about the future. And when people ask me what's changed in 5 years, I tell them this. Wales has shown that we can be proud of our distinct identity and our openness to be working with others, whether it's our farmers finding new markets, our manufacturers adapting to new circumstances, or our young people seeing fresh circumstances and opportunities. I'm confident the discussions ahead of you today will be lively and they're important. And I want to thank Anthony Snorter, Charles Smith and the Wales for Europe group. Thank you for flying the flag, for continuing to fly the flag, and for organising this vital event. People I know have worked tirelessly to keep that spirit of Europe alive. I also want to thank Geraint Davies and Helen Turner for the leadership you've shown over those 5 years. Wales, I hope, is showing what it means to be a confident, outward-looking nation that values all perspectives whilst building bridges with our neighbours near and far. We're not just adapting to change, we're shaping our future. I think, though, it's important that we make that emotional connection and demonstrate the relevance of our work to the public in Wales in all our efforts. That is going to be central to our success in the future. Diolch yn fawr.
Not only was it just kind of a one, people didn't rather treat it as a one-off kind of preference, right, that they went and ticked a box and then they left. Over time, what happened is these categories, leave and remain, were not just preferences or opinions anymore, but people took them on as identities, psychological identities. It's how they understood themselves and others. To the point where they became very powerful, and in fact, by 2018, more people identified with either a leave or remain identity, and the degree to which they felt attached to these identities was stronger than, say, party identity. Right? So rather than classic party identity, something that we talk about all the time, right? More people identified with these.
What I wanted to ask you is the implications for what you're saying for the rise of the right as well, the far right and populism. But I particularly wanted to ask you about the role of social media in and its ability to work with the emotions and identities that you identify And, you know, I think one of the other arguments that we kind of tend to fall back on is, oh, well, it was Russian bots and the whole, you know, election interference in Brexit through social media. I just wondered what you thought about that and if that had any part to play in your research. Thanks.
Taking on board what you said about being academics and not answering the question, I want to put a question to my fellow rejoiners, is how can we change the culture? How can we affect the culture to affect people's identity, to make it more European? Is that to me seems to be the question we should be asking.
My question is slightly away from the presentation today. I'm actually interested in what work you may be doing on the impact of personalities in politics.
And we have the data in all our surveys. Personalities in Wales operate actually the same as personality types everywhere. So if you want to know the general trends, there's the big five. Have you heard of the big five personality traits? Openness, agreeableness, extroversion, things like that. And it works in a very similar way. Is that what you mean?
Sorry, I was actually
He's talking about the modern kind of
I was talking about individuals actually, not psychological personalities, but individuals like Farage, Johnson.
Oh, I see. Sorry. I got my psychology hat on. In terms of their impact, well, we do look at the impact of leaders and their popularity or lack of popularity on the impact.
Are up 10%. Exports by the bottom fifth are exporters are down 30%. There are 20,000 firms that used to export to the EU that no longer do so. And actually it's the same the other way. There's a lot of small exporters from the EU who no longer bother exporting to the UK. And that's of course because the small guys pay the biggest price for the hassle, for the paperwork, for the bureaucracy, for the rules, and they have to spread that across a much smaller part of business. That bad news for small, okay for big, is not irrelevant. The world does not need bigger and bigger businesses with more and more oligopolistic power. The world needs more and more smaller businesses which give you variety, they give you choice, and they are tomorrow's big businesses. So don't just say, well, so what? It does matter. But what I would say is that it's only the beginning of what's going to happen. And big businesses in certain sectors will be, in fact, already are being in some sectors radically affected. Why does it take time? Well, it's very hard for business to uproot overnight. You've got physical capital. You can't just move an oil refinery or a chemical plant. You've got human capital. You can't just find another 1,000 specialist drugs researchers in another country. You can't just find some skilled artisans that do what makes you special. Your intellectual capacity is in your...
Back to Europe. How do we really reset this relationship? Because we've got a forthcoming meeting, haven't we? A forthcoming summit where the UK government will engage with the European Commission under the Trade and Cooperation Act to reset relationships with Europe. So very, very quickly, take your minds back to the debate about Brexit and juxtaposed to our membership of the European Union was the vision of, quote, global Britain. Yeah? That we will extricate ourselves from the EU and we will engage with the fastest growing regions of the world economy. And that will unleash the animal spirits of British capitalism and we will all flourish. I don't think I'm doing an injustice to that global Britain narrative. Honestly, that was pretty much what we were asked to believe. Let me just share with you one or two statistics because it beggars belief that a narrative could be built out of what the government's own findings. Free trade agreements, in my way of thinking at the outset, was they could never, ever, ever offset or compensate for our loss in European Union. Let's just remind ourselves very, very quickly. The Australian Free Trade Agreement that was crafted will deliver 0.08% boost over the long term to the British economy. The New Zealand trade agreement, even less, 0.0.
The cohesive vision, that's perhaps a challenge back to you as well as for Europe. We can listen to what's going on in the union world in terms of Europe, and then perhaps think, what's the offer that would make it a priority for trade union members to be campaigning on this issue, and to bring that emotional and practical vision that the First Minister talked about. Just before I start on trade, I wanted to pick up Kevin's point around the Shared Prosperity Fund. We're pleased to hear Mark Drakeford recently in committee saying that the UK government's committed to keep the Shared Prosperity Fund, that Wales gets around a quarter of that, and that is to continue from 2026. That's something we warmly welcome, because a big strand of that is around skills training for workers, and that's really important for the future economy, that remains a big part of the UK government's commitment to workers in Wales. So then, trade, in terms of one of the big things I want to talk to you about today. So that is a big practical change for the British TUC. We haven't had trade policy in Britain since 1973. It was something that was governed at European level since we joined the company.
Worker rights and alignments. So can I open this now up to the floor? Who's going to ask the first question? Alan Michael.
I'll wait for the microphone this time. I thought that Kevin took us to the heart of the matter in his final sentence, really. How do we craft a narrative that explains Europe in terms that are attractive in our marginalised communities? The biggest pain for me, I think, was a month before the referendum and talking to people on the doorsteps in Nice and Merthyr and places like that, whose instinct was all for leave, even though that wasn't a question of a rational argument, it was the heart. And I think that's a big question for us today. So thank you for the question, Kevin. Have you got the answer?
Does this work?
Yes,
Yeah. I wish I did have a clear, easy answer, Alan. But it seems to me, I think the First Minister alluded to this, that the same challenge for Brussels is the same challenge for the Senate, to translate what politicians, policymakers are doing, whether it's in Brussels or in Cardiff Bay, to translate that in such a way to our communities that people can see a clear linkage in terms of what it means for their everyday fears, whether it's cost of living, whether it's immigration, or whatever. And we all need to do better, including, by the way, my own sector, the university sector. Academics need to think more about the real societal impact of their research. I know it's beginning to happen, but together, working in concert to translate that political activity into meaningful things, to cost of living, food, childcare, dignified elder care. These are the things that dominate ordinary family lives, and we need to connect better with those fears. Sorry, I've got nothing more clearer or easier to understand than that, Alan, but I think we're on the same page in terms of appreciating the challenge.
Three contributions. When I saw Kerry earlier on, I told him he hasn't aged one bit since I saw him last. Can't say myself, can't say the same for myself, Kerry, or with great respect for Kerry either. But last time I saw Kerry, we were carefree young people just moving across borders in Europe without any restriction. We were in Stuttgart, I think, for a conference. David started with something emotional about his worker who was upset on the day after, and I know that scene was repeated in companies and small firms all around Wales. And Kevin has appealed to us to look for the emotional. And I think one emotional topic we ought to look at is freedom of movement. We daren't talk about it. The government have got an omerta against it. It's conflated with immigration. And it's not the same thing as immigration. Immigration is one way. Freedom of movement is a two-way process and a multi-way.
9 years ago, an event took place in Cardiff that you chaired, and it was involved a speech given by Will Hutton. And Will Hutton was asked, what was the future of social liberal democracy? And tying in with what the gentleman to my left from Swansea was asking about a little earlier, he said it was basically screwed until it found leaders who could vocalise and communicate very effectively that liberal and social democratic message. And I fear that what Kevin, David and Kerry have discussed on this panel session actually is just adding to the failure to articulate in a forceful way the message about Europe and the benefits it brings.
You're saying we need better tunes?
And also not just better tunes, but better singers as well.
Okay, I mean, I don't know that anybody want to respond to that. Can I just look?
Car manufacturer who closed a factory said this has nothing to do with Brexit. And why would they say that? Because they don't want to antagonise the 50% of the country who feel very emotional about Brexit and voted for it. Why would they do it? Because they don't want to antagonise Boris Johnson or Liz Truss, that wasn't good, or the governments in power. Still the same. I mean, it's not really clear where the Labour Party stands. So, in a sense, you cannot expect business to put their head above the parapet and necessarily tell it how it is, because it runs the risk of being thumped by consumers and politicians.
As we become more radical very soon, the economy will not improve, and it will be an electoral disaster in 2029 for them, because building a third runway in Heathrow isn't going to transform the economy by then. Yeah? That's my question. Do you think they're going to leave it too late, basically?
Yes.
Maybe you don't want to add to that?
Well, I'll be very brief. I think there is a very serious danger that both the major parties go into the next election discredited based on their track records. I have a lot more sympathy for Labour in that context than Conservatives, because frankly the UK was a hospital pass in 2024, but the electorate won't necessarily understand that and give it full credit. And in a situation where both those major parties are discredited, and with our electoral system, there is a serious risk of an outcome which is very, very frightening.
Gyda'r panel yma. Egluro hefyd, na dair yn cymeryd rhan yn y drafodaeth yn y panel yma. Felly mae gynnon ni gyflwyniadau ar y dechrau, ond mae am fod yn fwy o sgwrs yn hytrach na ar eithrio. Felly, swn i'n hoffi i ddechrau fo'i cyflwyno yr athro Elin Harper Jones. Mae Elin gweithio yn y maes ieithoedd lleiafrifol Ewropeaidd ers 30 o flynyddoedd hyn. Hi sydd yn arwain cyfnewidfa'r lle yn Cymru yn Mhrifysgol Cymru y Drindod Dewi Sant. Ac ers 2017, bydd aelod o grŵp arbenigwyr y Cyngor Ewrop ar y cyfryngau a'r Siarter Ewropeaidd ar gyfer ieithoedd rhanbarthol neu lleiafrifol. Hefyd mae gennym ni eluned haf, sef Pennaeth Celfyddydau Rhyngwladol Cymru, sydd yn asiantaeth ac yn rhan o Gyngor Celfyddydau Cymru. Cyn hyn, mi fydda eluned yn gweithio fel newyddiadurwaig, darlledu a fel swyddog Plas i'r blaid wedd yn Senedd Ewrop. And the third member of the panel this afternoon is Ruth Cox. Ruth was born in Wales and has been country director for the British Council in Wales since 2023, following a period as deputy country director for the British Council in Cairo, where she headed work on COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. She has also worked for the British Council in Afghanistan and East Asia. East Asia. And she's also worked in the European Parliament. So I'm going to hand over now to Ellie to guide us through this next session. So we're going to have about 45 minutes or so, really focusing on culture and creative industries.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Caroline, a diolch yn fawr iawn I Cymru dros Ewrop am drefnu y digwyddiad yma heddiw. Dwi'n meddwl bod o'n bwysig iawn fel dedodd Talfan ar y cychwyn y bod ni'n nodi y 5 mlynedd. Da ni ddim yn ei ddathlu o, da ni'n nodi fo, a da ni'n nodi fo hefyd drwy gyflwyno tystiolaeth bendant ynghyd a'n profiadau bywyd ni drwy gydol y cyfnod hwnnw. Ond wrth gwrs, wrth I ni ddechrau sôn am effaith ar y sector diwylliannol wedi cael ei gyhoeddi mewn bron I 15 o ieithoedd ar draws y byd, a nifer fawr o'r ieithoedd yna yn Ewrop. Da ni'n gwybod bod gennym ni artistiaid talentog, da ni'n gwybod bod gennym ni stori da ni eisiau deud wrth y byd, a da ni'n gwybod hefyd bod ni eisiau clywed straeon y byd. Felly mae'r cyfnewid diwylliannol yma wir yn holl bwysig I ni. A na I gloi go iawn ar y pwynt yma. Dwi'n siarad fel rhywun sydd yn fy 50au hwyr. Ac wrth gwrs mi oedd canlyniad y bleidlais a'r hyn sydd wedi digwydd wedyn yn dor calon anferth I fi. Ond be sy'n torri'n nghalon I fwy na dim ydy edrych I weld sut effaith mae hwn yn cael ar bobl ifanc, cenedlaethau sydd ddim wedi cael
Senedd Cymru I Delyth Jewel y cadeirydd a'r holl aelodau o bob plaid o'r pwyllgor hynny. Mae sioc ddiwylliannol yn adroddiad pwysig ac yn sobreiddiol iawn. Dim ystadegau pleserus ydy rhai sydd yn cael eu canfod yn yr adroddiad yma. Ac os nad ydych chi wedi darllen yr adroddiad, dwi'n mawr o'n grynu'ch bod chi'n neud. Mae'n adroddiad unigryw o fewn y Deyrnas Unedig ac felly hefyd yn Undeb Ewropeaidd. The Culture Shock report that the Culture Committee of the Senate published before Christmas, and we were part of launching that report in Brussels with our own European network that we're a member of on the move. It became really apparent through launching that report that there was very little knowledge about
actions through people across the world, through things that draw us together, commonalities, passions, things that transcend borders in arts and education. Our arts work covers every art form from architecture, dance, drama, sport, music, theatre, and our education work spans from higher education, schools, further education. And we have a lot of work in language. We work alongside modern foreign language, English language, Welsh language. We're present in over 100 countries overseas. We work with 200 countries worldwide. We have a reach of 650 million. So we are quite well placed to understand the word on the street post-Brexit and what that then looked like for the UK. I think where I'm worried, coming back to Wales and the UK, and I was on a plane from Bangkok to Yangon in Myanmar. I got off the plane in Yangon and I heard the results that it was a vote to leave the EU. And I remember it's like that moment, isn't it? You remember exactly where you were at that time. And I remember it so vividly, working on an EU programme on access to justice in Myanmar, and obviously everybody around us was devastated. And I should say this is British, I was embarrassed. I was embarrassed talking to EU colleagues. The shift that happened overseas with EU delegations towards us,
It really depended on the personality, I think, somewhat, but we were very much persona non grata, and it was, I struggled to represent the UK government at that time because of, you know, there were so many people who didn't want that result. So I have to be careful what I say, but there's some personal views. But really, we've seen the impact of Brexit on our work. We're currently present in 18 of the 27 EU countries, but because of a lack of funding in the non-ODA countries and non-overseas development system countries, that network is at huge risk. We know that geopolitics is changing. I was reading a great article this week where it talked about the chill winds of increasing MAGA-style nationalism blowing across borders. The impact of the war on Ukraine has been acutely felt and has increased polarisation and instability in Europe, and is deliberately fueled by hostile state actors. Disinformation, misinformation, malinformation is being used to create mistrust between European societies. And within this context, education and culture can play a huge role in supporting populations to think critically about misinformation and around social cohesion. And we've had projects that have done just that within Europe.
Mewn gwahanol gymunedau o gwmpas Cymru. A dyn ni wedi cael trafferthion anferth, fel mae'r gwaith gweinyddol dyn ni'n gorfod wneud i gynnal yr wyl yna ers Brexit. Dyn ni'n gorfod cyflogi un person ychwanegol jyst i wneud y gwaith papur. A mae o yn costio fwy i'r cwmnïau ddod, achos wrth gwrs dyn nhw jyst troi fyny. Dach chi'n mae beirdd yn rhad Victoria, gyda nhw jyst...
Next two speakers. The theme for this part of the afternoon is stability and security in Europe. And we've got two people wide regarded as elder statesmen in Wales in terms of development of politics and the Senedd, both with very strong supporters of Wales's position within Europe for many, many years. David Melding, a member of the Senedd for South Wales Central from 1999, so from the beginning of the Senedd to 2021. He was the Senade's Deputy Presiding Officer from 2011 to 2016. And he is also the former Deputy Director of the Welsh Centre for International Affairs and has written extensively on constitutional matters. He left the Conservative Party's front bench because of misgivings about the party's stance on Brexit, and is a board member of the Federal Trust. I'll also just quickly introduce Mick Antonew, a Senedd member for Pontypridd since 2011. Mick is a lawyer and was Counsel General in the Welsh Government from 2016 to 17, and again between 2021 and 24, during which time he was also the Minister for the Constitution. Mick comes from a Ukrainian family, has visited during the current war, and is a recipient of Ukraine's Order of Merit. He is also a trustee of the Welsh Refugee Council, so I'm really looking forward to hearing both of our speakers. Sorry.
It's very much the wrong direction, but also that we should look at the evidence, and the evidence, you know, is bleakly consistent, and especially when we look at the economy, which interests us very much, though I really enjoyed hearing about all the cultural issues in the previous session. But the economic impacts have really been deep and baleful. And it's, I think, a real shame that we are having this examination of the economic consequences rather than perhaps being able to anticipate them and get that across in the debate effectively. So we think that we should rejoin as soon as is practically possible. We're not, ignorant of the difficulties in practical terms, both with our European partners.
But more importantly, of course, 73 was when we joined the European Union. 74, of course, was when we had the referendum to whether to stay in the European Union or to come out. At that time, of course, I was opposed to joining the European Union in support of the concept of a socialist states of Europe. But the point about that period, of course, is what has happened since then is the massive globalization and technical change that has effectively meant that countries are now wholly interdependent with one another in order to survive. and that equally reflects the development of devolution, and I agree entirely with David said about the need for constitutional reform, and you know, my disappointment at the moment with what I hope is only a temporary a lack of commitment to the recommendations in what I think is one of the most important constitutional papers, and that is the report of Gordon Brown. Can I say also that one of the things I do want to say is that we will be forming a cross-party group in the Senedd on the issue of Wales and Europe, and we'll hopefully be putting that in place over the course of the next few weeks. Can I also add that just following on from the point David made, we went on for decade after decade, didn't we, where the issue of Europe and the or the antagonism towards Europe, all the things were being said, and we never answered that debate. You know, we never actually put a pro-EU debate. We never consistently argued those points that we could see as the world was developing and changing. And in many ways, we handed over that debate, which led to the ill-fated decision by David Cameron's
position in relation to Europe. And the position that we've adopted is that the UK has to make a choice. It either has to pivot back towards Europe or to attempt to engage the special relationship with the US. And the Lib Dem view is very clear that it is almost impossible to talk about a special relationship with the Trump administration. Here, after all, is a government, one of whose members is actively using his wealth and his media platform to undermine democratic government in the UK. We have to pivot back to towards Europe, not just for economic reasons, but for political and security reasons. So I just wanted to make three very brief points in relation to that. First of all, we spent a lot of time talking today about how Brexit has failed. But from the point of view of its advocates, there are many ways in which it's succeeding, and they are very important. If, like Dominic Cummings, you are somebody who believes in political disruption, the Brexit experience, the vote, the way that it has been implemented has profoundly toxified UK politics. Thankfully, it's something that we've largely avoided here in Wales. But it has also seriously undermined the Constitution. Liberal Democrats across the UK have always talked in terms of constitutional reform. We've seen the unlawful prorogation, we've seen
We have the air quality directives in place, then our air would be cleaner here in Wales. So there are benefits directly if we do that to Welsh citizens, but it also is the best, most positive pro-European message that we can send, that we want to be at the heart of Europe. And what better way, if we want to export to Europe, if we want to get investment from Europe, then what better a way can we prove our European credentials than having an Alignment Act in place. There are other things we can do to build on TAIF. TAIF, again, puts a little bit of moral pressure, doesn't it, on the Westminster government to sign up to that youth mobility scheme that has been on the table for some time from the European Union. We're cutting the budget. Everyone, you know, when we meet people in Europe, they say it's fantastic that Wales is doing this, but we're cutting the budget again. The budget was cut last year, it's going to be cut again next year, the draft budget. We should be increasing that budget and expanding TAIF's scope as well to other areas, using it for all forms of people-to-people exchange in education, in culture, in other spheres as well. We should be looking at our international offices. 20 years ago, Wales had an office in Milan, for example, when the WDA was there. We should be, now that we're outside the European Union, we've got to work harder to get Wales' message across. So we should be looking at our international network as well, so that we can send that message as positively as possible. But I'm an optimist. We're not where we want to be, but I think the future is still an internationalist future, and so there are when we look at the events today in Germany, we understand why it is so important that we get back into Europe and we strengthen Europe, because ultimately it is the bulwark against autocracy and the far right everywhere. It is the best example of international cooperation that has ever existed in history, and it's a beacon of light, unfortunately, in a time which has been very dark for democracies.
Became deeply Eurosceptical. But the Labour Party had gone from being more or less two-thirds reluctant to being a third party of Europe. I'm not sure applied at official policies of the centres of the EU, but certainly some of its senior members were very, very sceptical about the European project. And now that's changed, dramatically, and we've heard from Anthony about, the position of the Greens. I don't know what they were saying as the Ecology Party or whatever, but I will say this, the force in British and European politics the Greens now have was something that was only barely intimated in the 70s. So these are huge changes, and I think the Conservative Party has to realise it isn't sort of written on tablets of stone that it will always exist as one of the major parties of state, and therefore we really need to think about how we project ourselves and how we are constituted for middle 21st century politics. And some extraordinary things have happened. We heard about the Single European Act. Mrs. Thatcher's, it wasn't her initiative actually, she backed Lord Cofield, Conservative Commissioner, but did back it, and it was a huge advance in European integration. And then, given how divided much of opinion was in Britain, the Maastricht Treaty was an absolute incredible achievement of British statecraft. And the party that secured it then went about ruining it in terms of questioning it, undermining it, and then opening the door to profound Euroscepticism, for which we had the 2016 referendum, in part probably to try to resolve some of the internal issues in the Conservative Party. Though I do remind everyone, the other main parties, Liberals and Labour, also fought a referendum would be needed on our European membership. And far from uniting the Conservative Party, what happened in 2016 led to a very dramatic split in and around.
At least government is talking to EU governments. At least they're now talking about common economic and defence and other issues like that, and there are some common discussions taking place, so that is a step forward. Probably we'll move towards a situation where there is a better version of the existing trade and cooperation agreement that actually begins to dismantle some of these, and I would hope a lot of that then moves towards a position of the single market. Now, I say that, we're 6 months into a Labour government, 4.5 years away from the next general election. So the next 18 months, 2 years are actually the most crucial, because things become even more difficult when you get into the run-up of a general election. And that's why raising the tone of it and the debate is so much more important. There's a real issue in terms of the way the voting system that we have in our country focuses so much on political decision-making on a very small middle ground of peace.
When I was a student, the Student Union was an old church in Dumfries Place. I took my girlfriend there to an event, and the lineup was Shakin' Stevens and the Sunsets, the Swinging Blue Jeans, Bonzo Dog and Doodah Band, and Adge Cutler and the Whirls. You can work out for yourselves what year that was. It's 5 years since we formally left the EU. It's 9 years since the advisory referendum, which we lost 48.1 to 51.9%, took place. Overnight, the British media immediately converted the advisory referendum into a legally binding referendum, and the British media immediately rounded up that 51.9 to 100 and rounded down the 48.1 to 0. That was 9 years ago. The The maximum total term for a United States president is only 8 years. Pray God that stays the same. Pray God, pray to Allah, pray to anyone who's listening, that stays the same. The maximum term for the British Parliament is 5.
Between national identity and voting, and how important emotion and storytelling is when bringing communities on a political journey, which I think also came across strongly in the panel that we just had now. Many speakers on the business panel made the case for regulatory alignment between the EU and the UK. We heard impassioned contributions on the need for a cultural reset too. In the words of Elined Harve, the power that culture and the arts has to bring people together must not be underestimated. And we need this more than ever. So I take us back, the 31st of January 2020, 5 years ago today. I remember that date very well. Not only is it etched in my memory, but it was also etched on my work pass. It was my last day of work at the European Parliament in Brussels. It was an end of an era and an incredibly sad day for many. But fellow European colleagues and friends continued to be kind and thoughtful to the very end and beyond. The Plaid Cymru MEP Jill Evans held a Wales reception in the Parliament during the last week, where we were joined by Welsh organisations that worked in the EU and by Welsh people who live in Brussels. Although we knew at the time it was the end for now, there was a sense of hope that one day we would return. And I still hold that hope, and I do believe we will return one day. During my time in Brussels, I did miss home, and I quickly joined the Welsh Society. We'd meet at the Irish bar to watch the Six Nations together, and I couldn't feel more European than when I was around Swedish people, German people, and obviously Welsh people, all cheering for Wales. I feel very lucky to have experienced this, especially now in the knowledge that Welsh young people of today don't get to experience that, nor the freedom of movement that many of us in the room today would have benefited from. A number of generations of young people will now miss out on those experiences. Yesterday, I spoke in a debate in the House of Lords on the topic of youth mobility. Ahead of the Prime Minister's meeting with EU leaders on Monday, I asked the UK government whether they would proactively be putting forward a youth mobility proposal to the EU. The answer was a resounding no. I'm told that the meeting on Monday between the Prime Minister and EU leaders will be focused on geopolitical matters exclusively. Well, what a missed opportunity is that? If it is crucial that we are to reset our relationship with the EU, that we must be communicating clearly what that looks like. And it was heartening to hear the comments from Professor Kevin Morgan earlier, making the case for students not to be included in migration numbers. I wholeheartedly agree, and I hope that pressure is continued to be put on the UK government to also agree with us on this, for the sake of future generations. But I do continue to have hope. Most Fridays I visit schools and colleges across Wales to run politics sessions, and those sessions do give me hope. Our young people in Wales are empathetic and resilient. They offer very credible solutions to our very real problems, and I believe in them. We have a duty to create a Wales where our future leaders can thrive. The ability for our young people to network with their European counterparts is soft power that we must not underestimate. As was highlighted by Mick Antonou and David Malding earlier, the world around us is becoming more and more unstable. We must challenge the politics of isolation and build bridges with our fellow European friends. And I'd just like to end the conference on a positive note with some words from Oscar Wilde that were shared during the debate on youth mobility yesterday. Travel improves the mind wonderfully and does away with all one's prejudices. So diolch yn fawr iawn am y amser heddiw. Thank you for your time today.